back again. The reason for that is very, very good. And we're going to hear today about a comprehensive presentation on the causes and history of the Armenian genocide, as you will hear anywhere. Dr. La Porta is currently the High and Distinguished Librarian Professor of Armenian Studies at Cal State Fresno. Prior to that, he was a lecturer in Armenian and Religious Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His doctorate was conferred by Harvard University with honors in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. We're always glad to have you here, and you're about to learn a lot, so listen to that.
Thank you all for coming on a stormy week here in Sonoma. I was just down in Pomona. Don't feel left out. They're also suffering down south. But thank you all for coming here this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be part of this wonderful series. I'm going to move this down a little bit. It's always wonderful to be part of this incredible series, which every year educates so many students in a subject that not only has been historically of great significance, but unfortunately continues to be of significance in many ways to this day. So today I'm going to speak about the Armenian genocide, and what I want to touch upon while I'm here, some basic facts of the genocide. I'll start with that just so that everybody has a grounding. How many people here studied the Armenian genocide in high school? It's the law. This is like still annoying me. You know, California actually passed a law saying the Armenian genocide has to be taught in history classes in high school. I mean, I guess it keeps me coming here, so I can't complain too much. But ideally, you should have learned about this in covering World War I in high school. It's supposed to be part of the curriculum. Now, there's a reason why it isn't, and partially that has to just do with it's difficult to incorporate it within the curriculum, but it's also because textbooks don't include it. Textbooks often either leave it out completely, or they refer to it as the so-called or alleged genocide. And teachers have complained in the past that one of the difficulties for them in teaching it is there's no guidance because the textbooks don't say anything about it. I know there are many organizations like the Genocide Education Project up here in San Francisco that are trying to remedy that situation. But suffice it to say that this is still in a place like California, where it is one of the most, I would say, genocide-aware states in the Union. It's still an uphill battle in many instances. So just to make sure that we're all aware of the basic facts, I'll start off with some basic facts of the genocide. And then about where Armenia is and who are the Armenians. I don't like presenting them solely as the victims of a horrible crime. They had a long and culturally rich history prior to the genocide. Can't talk about all of that, but I do like to at least inform people and remind them that what we're dealing here is with human beings and an actual culture and not just with victims. So then we'll look into more like how did the genocide occur, what were the historical antecedents to it, what sort of circumstances led up to its execution. And then I also want to look at or bring in the fact that it's not just Armenians who were killed. It's commonly referred to as the Armenian genocide, and the Armenians were the largest group that was targeted and eliminated, but they weren't the only ones whom the Ottoman Empire at this moment killed. And then finally, I want to look at genocide and modernity. How does this relate to us, in other words? And hopefully also touch upon how it may relate to us even today. So that is the overall plan for the lecture. Hopefully most of you will be able to stay awake and stay through the whole thing. Okay, basic facts. First of all, on April 24th, 1915, 250 Armenian intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire were arrested. Most of them were shortly thereafter murdered. That is now taken as the inception of the Armenian genocide. Between 1915 and 1923, approximately 1.5 million people were killed, 800,000 in the first 4 months. I'll be returning to these numbers a little later on. Again, I'm not going to focus primarily on the numbers, but they do bear on our topic, obviously. It occurred in the Ottoman Empire under the direction of the ruling party of the Committee for Union and Progress, which is known as the CUP, which was a nationalist wing of the Young Turk movement. Again, I'll be talking about this a little bit later. And I'd like to remind everybody that although the Armenian genocide is a defining moment of Armenian history, particularly in the 20th century, it is not the defining moment of Armenian history. Thousands of years of Armenian history before the genocide, there will be thousands afterwards. And while this will remain a critical moment in its history, it does not define them. They are defined not solely by being victims of genocide. Okay. And we should also realize, though, the crime is denied to this day by the Republic of Turkey. So they don't, the Republic, the government of the Republic of Turkey, the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, does not admit that what happened was a genocide. I won't go into denialist theories here today. I don't like to give them that much credit. Okay. On the other hand, several people have recognized them. Probably the most important, if you're talking about genocide, is the International Association of Genocide Scholars. So they should know what they're talking about, and they consider it a genocide. Also, the International Center for Transitional Justice and the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity. If we're looking at sort of more political organizations, the European Parliament has officially recognized the Armenian genocide. The Council of Europe has officially recognized the Armenian genocide. The World Council of Churches has officially recognized the Armenian genocide. 20 countries and the Vatican City have recognized the Armenian genocide. Notice one country missing? Yes, right. We have not recognized it officially as a country, but 43 states have. And as I said, California is at the forefront of a lot of genocide recognition. And here I just wanted to include, this is the genocide commemoration monument that was erected at Fresno State in 2015. In commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. It's the largest such structure on any university campus in the country. The one pillar on the left-hand side, is from where you're looking, is 19 feet tall. The other one on the other side is 15 feet tall to commemorate the year 1915. So you can see it's a large structure. There are also panels on the inside that give the history of the Armenian people as well. So we're proud of the fact that we had the support of the university president and of the community to be able to build this structure and to get it done in time for the centenary. And hopefully it will be educating students at Fresno State and visitors for many years to come. We also should mention, and probably from one perspective, maybe the most important development that's happening, are Turkish scholars who are re-examining their past, are starting to admit that this was a genocide. That they realized that they were brought up on a history that was not true. And in coming to terms with their own national history, they are challenging the government in the Republic of Turkey and advertising or exploring and investigating the causes of the genocide and how it unfolded. This is a very, it's a mixed reaction. I have many friends who fall into this category. They are both, depending on whom you ask, some of them are very optimistic and some of them are very pessimistic about it, in the sense that they're optimistic. The ones who are optimistic think that more and more people, this is becoming more and more recognized, particularly amongst Turkish intellectuals. On the other hand, they're pessimistic, and if you ask them whether the Republic of Turkey will ever admit that this happened, they will say no. Despite all of their own efforts, they firmly believe that the Republic of Turkey will never admit the fact that this was a genocide. And their reason for believing so is that if the government does that, then the country will fall apart, because everybody will realize the entire foundational philosophy of the Republic of Turkey is built upon a lie. I'm more hopeful than they are, but I take what they say very seriously. Okay, so where is Armenia? A more basic question. This is where Armenia is today, this little country here. You can see it's quite tiny. It's actually, there are two countries in that little area. Look, these are former Soviet Central Asian and Caucasian republics. If we zoom in, as you can see, there are two countries here. This is the Republic of Armenia. This is the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. The Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh is not recognized by any country in the world. They declared independence in 1991. 1991, Republic of Armenia declared independence. Nagorno-Karabakh had a referendum within the Republic of Azerbaijan with which it was included, and they also voted for independence. This is a problem that has not been resolved to this day. They fought a war against Azerbaijan. We'll look at that briefly again later on in the lecture. But for the most part, not even the Republic of Armenia recognizes the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, and this is for geopolitical reasons. I mean, they have good relations, but they don't recognize it officially. As you can see, it's a very tough neighborhood to live in. They're bordered by Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Iran. In that constellation of countries, Syria is also not far away. In that constellation of countries, their best friend actually is the Republic of Iran on many levels. You know you're in trouble if your best friend's the Republic of Iran. The United States has had good relations on and off again with the Republic of Armenia, but it's always caught in a difficult geopolitical situation. Its current size of 11,500 square miles is about 1/10 the size of what is known as historical Armenia. And that's not necessarily a state, but the area in which Armenian culture, people, language thrived historically. And if we look at Armenia in the 19th and 20th centuries, you can see that that corresponds more or less to what we know as historical Armenia. So you can see even in the 19th and 20th centuries, most Armenians were split between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. There were also some here in Persia, in the Safavid and the later Qajar empires. But these were the main areas of Armenian inhabitation where Armenians lived. And the genocide, as we know, it took place primarily in these 6 provinces of the Ottoman Empire known as the Armenian provinces of the Ottoman Empire. We'll see more of that later. Okay. All right, significant factors of Armenian self-identity. Well, you know, what makes an Armenian Armenian? One of them is a long history. Right? And you can walk into people's houses and you'll see pictures of, let's say, King Tirdat or King Tigran the Great, who lived in the 1st century BCE and managed to conquer territory between the Caspian Sea all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. All right? So people are still named Tigran or Dikran to this day. They're also very proud of their Christian faith. Right? They were the first nation to convert to Christianity. They weren't the first Christians, but they were the king Tirdat at about the beginning of the 4th century accepted Christianity as his personal faith and the faith of his territory, and went about evangelizing the country. They have their own church. It's known as the Armenian Apostolic Church, with its own head known as the Catholicos. And the Catholicos of all Armenians resides in Echmiadzin, which is just outside of Yerevan in Armenia. Also, language is an important factor of self-identity. They invented their own alphabet in 406 for their language in order to translate the Bible, but it's the same alphabet that's continued to be used to this day. So if you have learned the Armenian alphabet and you learned Armenian, you have access to over 1,600 years of literature. And they produce literature throughout that entire period. So that's also very important to them. And then finally, we have the homeland dispersion phenomenon. Armenians, having been around for such a long time, obviously have traveled. This is the current diaspora, as it's known, which is largely a result of the genocide. However, did have antecedents in dispersed Armenian communities who traveled for one reason or another. Economic reasons, political reasons, personal interest, and formed communities. If you look at Armenian communities in the 18th century, you can find them everywhere from Birmingham and Manchester in England all the way through Southeast Asia, Tibet, Shanghai in China, and into Malaysia. So they even got into the Americas in the 17th century, but they went back. There were a couple of guys who seemed to have come over on boats and then decided to go back. So they were always a global phenomenon in that way, but we see a different dynamic appear after the genocide and the creation of diasporic communities throughout the world. Okay, so what about Armenians in the Ottoman Empire? You can sort of see here. In the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire captures Western Armenia, or this area here, and sort of brings them under subjugation. There's still a lot of work to be done in understanding the dynamics of Ottoman expansion in this area, but nonetheless, the most important development, I would say, for the Armenians was that at the other half of this border was the Persian Empire of the Safavids from the 16th century onwards. And there were a series of wars between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire in Iran. And even though the Armenians were not involved directly in this conflict, the battle was fought in Armenia, in the land where Armenians had always lived. And this caused a lot of havoc. Obviously, just by having armies traverse that land created economic hardship, destroyed the crops. Often these wars were followed by several years of famine due to crop failure. However you want to look at it, it was not a pretty picture in that part of the empire. And this meant that many Armenians start moving. Right? This is one of the reasons why a lot of Armenians start moving westward. Right? They start moving westward, particularly to Constantinople, the capital, so that Constantinople becomes the largest Armenian city in the empire eventually, as well as other urban centers in the western part of the empire. Still usually on the Anatolian Peninsula, but nonetheless in the west. And this forms the backbone. As one generation moves there, then subsequent generations start moving there as well. And by the 19th century, we can note an affluent, urban, right, Armenian class. I'll talk a little bit about that more shortly, but just so we can see that this is somewhat of a change in historical direction. Most Armenians out here, although there were urban Armenians, but Armenians traditionally had been country people. They remained largely agricultural peasants in the empire, but they liked horseback riding. They liked, fighting on horseback. They liked being in the country, being outdoors. And it's only at this moment that you start to see them concentrate more and more in urban centers, with which they later become associated. So what would it like for an Armenian in, let's say, Constantinople around 1860? It's one of the questions that people ask, is like, well, why were Armenians staying in the Ottoman Empire if things were so bad, such that within or about a half a century after this moment, the Ottoman Empire will try to eliminate them and effectively eliminate them from Turkey. Why are they still there? Why don't they leave? And one of the things is that if you're looking at being an Armenian in Constantinople in 1860, it's actually one of the best places in the world to be. Right? Everybody would love to be there. It was an incredibly exciting time. There was a time of hope, excitement, change. The Ottoman Empire was going through reforms based on both internal and external pressures, particularly between the period of 1830 and 1870. These were called the Tanzimat, or the reform movement that was called Tanzimat collectively. And these were meant to increase education, trade, create greater equality between all the citizens, right? Because the non-Turkish elite were always considered second-class citizens. There was a special tax on Christians. There were a lot of discriminatory policies in place that these reforms are supposed to alleviate, right? And protect the life and property of all subjects, regardless of faith. All right? So this was considered a great progressive movement within the Ottoman Empire. And Armenians, not only Armenians, but many subjects throughout the empire thought that things were moving in a good direction. Likewise, you have to remember that the Ottoman Empire was just must have been an incredible place to have been born and raised. Especially if you're in a place like Constantinople, you would have been polyglottic. That is, you would have spoken many languages. You would have been bumping into people from all over the world constantly. And if you were, you grew up there, you would know Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Ladino, which is the language of the Jewish population, French, Italian, German. You would hear that in your daily trip across the Bosphorus, or you would hear that as you go into the market. So it would have been an exciting and dynamic place to grow up. It was sort of like it's the New York City, of its day. And you can see it's an incredibly beautiful city, remains to be. So this is one reason why Armenians are saying they're doing well in what was probably one of the best cities in the world, if you're looking at it from that perspective, right? They had developed a wealthy and a middle class, right? They had positions in the government. They they owned the shipyards. They controlled the paper mill. They had the gunpowder mill. They were the imperial architects. If you go to Istanbul today, which is what Constantinople was renamed in the Republican period, right? They'll show you all these 19th century buildings that are these beautiful, palaces and mosques that belong to designed by Armenian architects, particularly the Balian family. Right? They tend to leave that part of it out. But nonetheless, that was their city. They recognized the buildings there. They helped build them. They were in sensitive places. Now I say they were in these sensitive elements of the economy, sensitive sectors of the economy, for one good reason, which is they were the least likely to revolt. Right? You could trust an Armenian in a power position such as gunpowder and paper. Right? Paper mills are important because currency is printed on paper. So controlling the military supplies and your currency supplies. Right? It's very unlikely that it's next to nil that an Armenian would ever try to use that to their own personal advantage to depose the Sultan. So in a lot of dictatorial regimes, you see what we would now refer to as minorities or discriminated ethnic religious groups seem to enjoy certain privileges and favors, and it seems like, oh, look how tolerant they were. It's not really they're not doing this because they love Armenians or they think they're so, they were educated and they were useful, but there's also a degree of self-preservation. Right? So if you look at it, for example, if you look in Syria today, under the Assad family in Syria, Armenians also did very well. It's not because the Assads love Armenians. It's really because they know there's no chance that the Armenians are going to revolt and kill the family. So they like to we see a similar thing happening with Jews in Europe as well in many situations where they can be trusted with certain things only because they don't constitute a threat. And we have a similar idea going on here with Armenians. But nonetheless, if you're in one of those positions, you're enjoying the wealth, you're enjoying the privileges, it was a good life. Armenians, including women, and this is a big deal, are being educated as well. Starting in the 1840s, they send this wealthy and middle class send a lot of their children to Europe to be educated. But then we have Protestant and Catholic missionaries opening up schools within the Ottoman Empire. Now those schools were meant for everybody, but obviously Muslims wouldn't go to them because they were run by Christians, and there was an element of religious, both conversion and just education. But Armenians start going to them, particularly to the Armenian women. And this became very important because many Armenian women who survived the genocide, right, and the majority were women who survived the genocide, when they came to wherever they were going, or let's say to the United States, they had been educated. And they brought with them a lot of social capital that otherwise they may not have had not this education reform movement begun. Armenians also opened up their own schools, but by far the most popular ones were the ones run by the Roman Catholics and the Protestant missionaries. And this is the famous Robert College in Constantinople, which still exists to this day. I think it's Sabancı University, or Boğaziçi University now in Turkey. But I can give you a personal account of my wife's of Armenian descent. Her grandmother and her grandmother's sisters had attended Robert College, and then when they came to the United States were already educated, and her great aunt was therefore was in the first class at Radcliffe, the Harvard University, when they started allowing women into Harvard University. She was in the first graduating class of that. And coming from people who had been kicked out of their homeland, right? That's a very fast rise through society. Likewise, another one of her great aunts became the first female book reviewer of the New York Times Review of Books, right? And she was handicapped. She had a hunchback. So here you have an immigrant who didn't grow up speaking English as her native language, was self-educated at home because she was handicapped and could only go to school later, who becomes the first female reviewer of books for the New York Times Book Review. So you can see they come with a great degree of social capital that many other migrants don't necessarily have. And that allows them to do well when they get to their new country. And that's in great part due to the educational efforts of the missionaries and the receptivity of the Armenian community to those education efforts. And at this period, too, there's a cultural awakening. It's not until now that you actually get modern Armenian, the language, being used for literature. We see a whole movement take place in which modern Armenian is standardized, particularly in Constantinople. That's one dialect. Another dialect is standardized in Tbilisi. But we see the starting of newspapers, magazines. One of the amazing things you can do, as Diane said, I spent time in Jerusalem and taught there. There's an Armenian monastery in Jerusalem, and they have a wonderful collection of newspapers. Every two-bit town, right, of the Ottoman Empire had an Armenian newspaper. They weren't always successful, right? Sometimes they lasted a year or two, but nonetheless. And it's not by accident, too. 1916, 17. I mean, Armenians started arriving in the United States 1880s and 90s in larger numbers. Right away, Fresno's got 3 newspapers. Armenian newspapers in Armenian. And then they gradually switched to Armenian English and then purely English. But again, that's something that they bring with them from the Ottoman Empire. What do? How do you communicate with each other? You start a newspaper. And you put ads in those newspapers. Have you seen my family? Looking for an Armenian to marry, right? This is, I've got the best bureks anywhere. So, and they communicate across vast distances through this print medium. So they're very accustomed to it from this cultural awakening that happens at this moment in the Ottoman Empire. They start their own playhouse that becomes popular not only with Armenians but also with Turks. They, as I said, they translate literature, they write plays, they have a poetic movement that is fantastic. Unfortunately, all of this is brought to an end in 1915. And it's not as though it's, the people are the great loss, the great tragedy, but there is also this amazing cultural dynamic that is started and is only 50 to 60 years old at the time when it's just cut short. And so it's important to realize that we were at the birth of something when this happens, or at the maturation of something. Okay, so how do we go from here? And this is a wealthy, upper middle class family in Constantinople around this time, 1860, 1870, to here, in just a matter of decades. Right? It would seem impossible. If you could, say now, 30 years from now, this is what's going to happen to you, you'd probably be completely dumbfounded about how that could happen. Okay. First of all, we have to recognize that what I've been showing so far pertain to a group of people who were privileged and they lived in certain centers of power and in urban areas. Right? The mass of Armenians remained agricultural peasants, and in these provinces, as we said, the 6 Armenian provinces in the eastern part of the country. The reforms that helped the Armenians in the western part, those Tanzimat reforms, were not always implemented in the East. And this is a major problem of the Ottoman Empire for a long time. Lots of things that are promulgated in Constantinople, by the time they make it out to Bitli Servan, are completely forgotten about, right? Or they're not enforced, right? So that the local ruler says, that's nice, and throws it out the window and whips the guy who brought him the message, and nobody does anything about it. And we get lots of complaints from the Armenians in the East back to Constantinople saying, we saw the reform law, but the local mayor, governor, is not implementing it. Can you tell the Sultan to send, troops out here or something to help them enforce this? All right? And obviously the local elite don't want people from Constantinople coming and telling them what to do. All right? So there's a built-in problem there. There's a sense, however, of greater law and lawlessness and abandonment, right, in the East. It does seem like it's sort of I wouldn't call it the Wild West because it's in the East, but there doesn't seem to be a framework within which these reforms can actually be upheld, and which Armenians and others, other minorities or ethno-religious communities can feel any sort of security. And we have the demographic problem where the Armenians are the majority in Van, this area here, And they're in a plurality in many of these other ones, but in some places like Sabbasia, they're a minority. And that's just purely in numbers. Right? And they're still say culturally or economically, there may be different factors at play, but numerically, they're only a clear majority in the province of Van in the Far East. All right, so we can see there's been a demographic shift that's happened. There are a number of Kurds are the other large group of people who live out there, and they're Muslim. Also, there are numbers of people who have fled both Europe and the Caucasus as the Russian Empire and the European powers take over lands that once belonged to the Ottoman Empire. And we'll see that in a little bit as well. Okay, as I said, there are a series of military defeats. You have to memorize this map for the test. I'm just joking. That's right. There are a series of military defeats in the 18th and 19th century, so that basically the Ottoman Empire loses a lot of the territory on its border areas, right? Particularly in Europe, the Balkans, Greece becomes independent, right? There's a series of military defeats that creates distress in the Ottoman Empire. There's an expanding Russian Empire, right? Russian Empire is a Christian empire, and it's pushing south. And as I said, as both Europe and Russia expand, the Muslim populations of a lot of the area that they take over get up and move to the Ottoman Empire saying, we were your subjects, now find something for us. And one of the things that they do is quickly try to push them to other parts of the empire out of the major urban areas. So they settle them, for example, in the eastern provinces. Right? The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 78 is particularly humiliating. We'll talk about this in a second. The Ottomans lose, but they don't. The actual peace treaty that resolves the war is not so bad for them, particularly because, or especially or only because Europe, the great powers of Europe, don't want Russia to make too many gains. So they force Russia, even though Russia wins the war, to hand back a lot of the territory that they've conquered, so that Russia won't be able to control, particularly the Black Sea. They're having problems competing in the international economy. They're borrowing lots of money from Europe. And Europe, much let's say, for example, what's happening with Germany and Greece today. As the Ottoman Empire borrows money from Europe, Europe then starts attaching conditions onto what life is like inside the Ottoman Empire, saying, well, we've just given you $1 million. Now you have to do this, 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 and this. And so it starts to be used as a bargaining chip, or I would say more of a cudgel on the part of the European powers towards the Ottoman Empire. And while the reforms helped, right, the minorities, I don't really like using this term, minorities. They're not really minorities. As I said, sometimes numerically they're a majority. But we tend to call them ethno-religious communities. At this moment, there is a process of what we would call minoritization, where one has to start thinking, well, both Europe is seeing them as minorities, and then the Ottoman Empire starts to see them as minorities. Whereas before, they were considered as separate nations within the Ottoman Empire in many respects. But these reforms, which are meant to help what were second-class citizens, however, nonetheless experience a backlash by provincial Muslims. It's like, look, for 400 years, I've been able to do whatever I wanted with the Christian down the street because he's a second-class citizen. Now, all of a sudden, he's being elevated to my equal. They often saw that as I'm being reduced to his equal. And so in many areas, they, as much as not only weren't they enforced and not implemented, but there was even a backlash where this was seen as particularly European Christian involvement in the empire to try and strengthen these Christian groups within the Ottoman Empire at the expense of the local Muslim population. And that leads to Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and who reigned from 1876 to 1909, who develops what is one of the proponents of a pan-Islamic or pan-Islamist ideology. Right? He himself is looking at that as the caliph and as the sultan of the Ottoman Empire, he tries to create this idea of all Muslims should unite under his power, and that will help stabilize the Ottoman Empire. It also came with an anti-Christian ideology, right, where he starts to see the Christian communities within the empire as fifth columns, foreigners, a source of trouble and weakness who cannot be trusted. Right? This is partially a result of European involvement in Ottoman affairs as well, where European powers, particularly Russia, claimed to be the protector of all the Orthodox Christian communities in the Ottoman Empire. Or France would try to protect all of the Roman Catholic communities in the empire. Something that was Austria often as well. And again, they would use the financial burdens of the Ottoman Empire often to try and have the Ottoman Empire give certain privileges to Christian communities within the empire. So this had created, as I said, a somewhat of a backlash, a reaction on the part of Muslims in general, but specifically of the Sultan himself, who wanted to sort of push back against this. And this was exacerbated also by the loss of the Russo-Turkish War in 1877-78. As we noted before, Russia controlled other parts where there were Armenian communities. And Armenians in Russia, some of them had risen in the military to become generals. And the Sultan knew that there were Armenian generals fighting in the Russian army. And he starts to think of the Armenians within the Ottoman Empire, even though many of them explicitly said that they should be supporting the Ottoman Empire against the Russians in this war, as potential fifth column within the empire. Between 1895 and 96, it actually starts in 1894, there are a series of what we can call pogroms are launched by the empire in which 100 to 200,000 Armenians are killed. Other Christian communities also suffer within the empire. And tens of thousands of Armenians flee. And this, in many respects, becomes the first seed of communities, particularly in the United States, but not only in the United States, but particularly in the United States for Armenian communities. And although they didn't know it then, they were the lucky ones. Because they escaped the Armenian genocide by having fled after 1895-96. And having come to America also meant that it was very difficult, given travel conditions, to return. Many of the ones who went to Europe after Sultan Abdul Hamid II is deposed, we'll see this in a second, maybe I'll just move this slide, in the coup of 1908 return. He's overthrown in 1908. It's not just Armenians who don't like him. By this time, there are liberal Turks who want his removal, including his own nephew doesn't support him. They're looking more towards a constitutional sultanate based on, let's say, something that was going on in England, right, where he was trying to impose a more autocratic sultanate. The other minority groups, Jews, Arabs, Greeks, also were displeased with Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and the army. Significant portions of the army were dissatisfied. And so in this coup in 1908, he is overthrown. We get what is called the Young Turk Constitutional Government that lasts between 1908 and 1913, in which the Armenians participated. And because of this coup, many of the Armenians who had fled after 1895-96 returned to the Ottoman Empire. They said the ones who came to America were a little bit luckier in that it was too difficult. If you just already schlepped all the way to Fresno, from, Beatles in the middle of the Ottoman, it's very unlikely that you're now about to make the reverse trip. It's just very difficult physically. However, if you went to Geneva, you went to France, it's a boat right away. It's a quick train right away. So many of the Armenians who went to Europe returned, right, and to help build what they were considering a new Ottoman Empire. Right? And many famous writers, political thinkers, even clergy went back. And unfortunately, they were some of the first ones to be rounded up at the beginning of the genocide and executed. And so their love of their homeland is what eventually gets them killed in that sense, because they return in a desire to help build this new empire, and in return, they wind up being murdered. Okay. Despite this constitutional government, in which it is better than Sultan Abdul Hamid, there are still problems lurking. Okay? And in particularly the military nationalists, known as this Committee of Union and Progress, remained dissatisfied. And while on the one hand you had this, one side of this pan-Islamist ideology, their ideology became what's known as pan-Turanian. It was the idea of uniting all of the ethnic Turks under one rule and thereby strengthening the state. And that becomes the nationalist ideology that becomes dominant in the empire, and it turns into an exclusionary nationalist empire. The phrase that starts going around is Turkey for Turks. And Armenians too said, yeah, sure, we're all Turks. And that's not what the nationalists meant. Right? They didn't mean Turkish as in we are all part of the Ottoman Empire, we're all living in Turkey. They meant people who were ethnically Turkish. And this becomes obviously a problem as we move along. In 1913, fed up with the military losses, the continued military losses of the constitutional government, they launch a coup, particularly the military nationalist wing. And they take control of the government. The leaders are Enver, the Minister of War, Talat, the Minister of the Interior, and Cemal, the Minister of the Navy. These guys are known as the Triumvirate. And in particular, all three of them are associated as the architects of the Armenian genocide, but it's particularly Talat, who's the Minister of the Interior, who is the primary architect and person who puts the Armenian genocide into motion. They have dreams, as I said, of Turkish grandeur, of reconquering or of conquering all of the areas to the east so that Turkey and the Turkish, the Turanian Empire would stretch from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Because there are various Turkic peoples in between through Central Asia, and they thought if they could just get around the Caspian Sea and into Central Asia, then they could take over this entire block of land that would allow them to reestablish this sort of mythical Turanian empire that would stretch from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. And with that idea in mind, Enver signs a secret alliance with Germany in 1914. And even though the Germans were not anxious to have the Turks enter the war, he nonetheless preempts them and leads a disastrous campaign into the east. Germany and the Ottoman Empire were allies prior to the war as well. And part of the reason for this was that Germany felt gypped in the colonialist sort of grab that had happened during the 18th and 19th centuries as France and England and Spain were able to colonize all these other, even Italy has managed to get Ethiopia and Eritrea. Right? Germany wasn't able to. Becoming a nation late and not having real access to seaports was not able to capture territory that they could then take all of the precious natural resources out to help build its economy at home. So instead what it decided to do was to form an alliance with the Ottoman Empire and build the Berlin to Baghdad railway and send military advisors to the Ottoman Empire to help build the Ottoman army, particularly during this period, and thereby get a foothold in the Near East. That was one of their ideas. Turkey, as I said, or the Ottoman Empire, the leaders of the Triumvirate were looking from Germany for military assistance in fulfilling their dreams of territorial expansion. So he leads this drive to the east. At first, it goes really, really well. They're pretty much unimpeded all the way up across eastern Anatolia until they reach Sarıkamış in January of 1915, at which point the Russians decimate them. And the weather also turns. It becomes cold in winter, snow. Enver, it's a terrible disaster. They lose tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of men. They lose all of their they wind up having to eat their horses if they're lucky. It's a terrible retreat where people are dropping dead, and he returns back to the capital with very little of his army left. And as soon as he gets back there, he says, the reason why we lost is because Armenians turned against us in eastern Anatolia, and all of a sudden we were in the hands of the enemy. This wasn't true by any stretch of the imagination, but nonetheless, it very quickly turns into one of the starting points to quickly moving actually into the Armenian genocide. There is still some debate today how quickly or when exactly the CUP put in the Armenian solution into motion. In the sense of, was this a plan that they had already conceived of 1911, 1913? This happens and they say, let's take advantage of the opportunity? Or was it something that spontaneously arrives in their head or in Enver's head on his way back from this disastrous battle? That's still not entirely certain, with scholars arguing on both sides. It must have been premeditated even before then, because we can see it moves very quickly. In February of 1915, the disarmament orders go out for Armenians, right? They had only recently been allowed to carry weapons, and now the orders went out to disarm them. This was often used as an excuse. Many people out east carried a rifle, right? They hunted for food, right? They were also constantly worried about attacks by Kurdish tribesmen. But the searching for a firearm became the excuse for for the Ottoman military to search houses, right? Arrest people, throw them into jail, as well as to kick the Armenians out of the military or reduce them to labor battalions. On April 8th, the Armenians of the town of Zeytun are deported, right? On April 19th, we get massacres in the Van region. Fighting starts out there. On April 24th, we get the arrest and execution of the 250 Armenian leaders in Constantinople, right? And then by 1916, over 1 million people are dead and 500,000 displaced. And I'll return to this again. It's not the numbers, but the speed with which this is done is indicative. It's quite rapid. As you can see, between, as I said, in the first 4 months, 800,000 people are killed. Before 1 year has passed, 1 million people have died. This sort of speed makes genocide very, very difficult to stop once it's started. And by 1923, 1.5 million people have been killed. Okay. Here's a map to show the sort of destruction of the Armenian population. You can sort of make out here all of these darker areas. The darker the area, the greater the percentage of Armenian population. Right? So that's what you're looking at in 1914, and that's what you're looking at in 1926. I think that's one of these. And so you can see, very Armenian, not so Armenian afterwards. So that's one way of looking at it graphically. Okay, and as I said, it's not just the Armenians. Armenians are the primary target of the genocide, but it's not just them. Okay, we have Assyrian Christians. A large population in Turlock, California, and they're still there, as well as New Jersey, but New Jersey's got everybody. They trace their ancestry back to the Assyrian Empire, but they converted very early to Christianity. And you can see here, if we're looking at here, the Armenian, it did overlap with the Armenian provinces, but it's further to the south. Contemporary reports record between 200 and 250,000 killed in southeastern Turkey and the Urmia region between 1915 and 1923, but it's possibly as high as 400,000. Okay? It's sometimes hard to tell the difference between an Assyrian and an Armenian. They were very much, and especially in these areas here, in the region of Diyarbakir and in Van, they're very much living together. They intermarried. Many Assyrians were Armenized. But nonetheless, they did have a separate community. But it's hard to get the number. I mean, numbers in this are very difficult in general. We're lucky that the Armenian Church, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire all took censuses, so we get some idea. But for the Assyrians, it's a little bit more questionable, the exact numbers here. And 1915 to this day is known as the year of the sword in Assyrian tradition, the Seifo. Right? And it was over half their population. So it was a terrible genocide of the Assyrians as well that happens at the same time. In 2007, it was recognized by the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and in 2015, it was recognized by the Republic of Armenia as a genocide as well. All right, so this is also a relatively newly recognized genocide, although the community has been dealing with the problem for a century. Likewise, Greeks. This will come up. The Greek genocide. They also have a long history in Anatolia. Right? It goes back 1000 BC, however you want to look at it. And they too, as we know from Paul, are among the early converts to Christianity. Right? And they were, especially at this moment, located in Thrace, the Pontic region along the Black Sea, and in Cappadocia. Now, the numbers range, again, for the Greek genocide, between 450,000 and 900,000 Greeks may have been murdered during this period of time. The most famous example is the catastrophe of Smyrna in 1922, where the city was set on fire by Ottoman troops, and the Christian population was pushed basically to the sea. Most people did not know how to swim, and were either burned to death or drowned to death. Adding to the horror was that there were American and French ships in the harbor, and they were told not to pick up anybody who was in the water. And so there's a number of people who have stories of of people who died, relatives who died in that catastrophe. And we have the reports, the captains looked on and just said, like, these people are dying, and they were not given clearance to take them up because that would be getting involved in what they considered a civil conflict and not one that they could be involved in. It seems to be up to 100,000 people, Greeks and Armenians, who were living in the city. And then, if you're looking at the final blow for the Greek population of Anatolia, is the population transfer of 1923 that was agreed between Greece and Turkey. Over 1 million people left Anatolia and were settled in Greece. And likewise, the Muslim population of Greece moved into Anatolia. So incredibly disruptive transfer of populations. Again, pretty much put an end to the Greek population of Anatolia. Okay. In 2007, this too was recognized by the International Association of Genocide Scholars as a genocide, and likewise the Republic of Armenia recognized this officially as a genocide in 2015. And so all of these three are considered together nowadays as part of the Armenian genocide. Even though it had slightly different contours for each community. Okay, what about the genocide and modernity? Because one of the things about the Armenian genocide, it's a horrible thing to say, but people have been slaughtered for centuries. It's nothing new. Obviously, the conquest of the United States of America required or took a genocide while it was being done. Right? I think you learned about this a couple of weeks ago. So what distinguishes the Armenian genocide in many respects? First of all, it has what we call the paradigm of genocide. It conforms to the paradigm of genocide that we see in modern genocides. It has the use of technology, right? Which also is, we'll see, it's not quite, our technology, but nonetheless, it's for the time, it was the latest technology. The legalization of genocide. One of the interesting aspects of modern genocides are how the perpetrators just don't kill. When the Mongols came through, they killed people, they killed them, they kept going, they didn't really care about it. But there's an obsession with modern genocides in which they have to legalize it. That is, they pass laws that make it so that the extermination of a people is legitimated in some ways, at least for their own internal consumption. Right? And so we'll see that. International relief effort. The first real international relief effort followed upon the Armenian genocide right? And we can look at the formation of the contours of the modern Middle East. All right, so these all are results of the genocide. Okay, so let's look at the paradigm. First of all, we get the classic denigration of the victim population as being unclean, vermin. They need to, the Ottoman Empire needs to be sanitized, right? Because these people are polluting it. This is very familiar to anybody who's studied other forms of genocides where the population about to be exterminated needs to be dehumanized, right? There's a pattern to the extermination, right? This is a map of the major areas. The big red dots are the major areas of extermination, and the lines often follow the paths of deportation of the Armenian population. But normally what happened in each of these cases, the men were first gathered under some pretext, often the disarmament laws, but not only that, they were told that you're going to be moved for your own safety. The men were gathered and taken out of town. Often they were shot or bayoneted soon after leaving the town they were from. In other cases, they allowed them to get to the next town to write home a letter to say, hey, we made it, and then they were bayoneted or shot, and they were often bayoneted so that they wouldn't have to waste bullets. Right? We hear the orders where they say, like, don't shoot them, bayonet them. Then the elderly, the women and children were told they had to leave, and they would be marshaled out of town, and then they were taken into the desert and towards Aleppo, often first, and then after Aleppo, which it's hard to see on this map, but then they were taken into Deir Zor along the Euphrates. Deir Zor recently ISIS captured it and destroyed the Armenian church there for the Armenian martyrs of the genocide. But Deir Zor became a concentration camp of Armenians, where hundreds of thousands of Armenians were left to die in the desert. We know that many cases from letters of the commanders, who were not always sure what they were supposed to be doing with this, but we have letters, particularly from Arab military commanders, who write back to their families saying, I don't know what I'm doing, but we're marching around the desert in circles with women, old women, and children. And he's like, I didn't join the army to do this. I joined the army to defend our land, not to walk people around in circles. So we get these sorts of complaints from people who were not in on the game, although a lot of them figure out that what's going on is the extermination of these people, although they don't know why. So we can see there's this methodical approach to the elimination. Likewise, as I mentioned, this was when I kept on saying those numbers, it's a simultaneity, which is very important. As I said, between April and August of 1915, those 4 to 5 months, the Armenians of nearly every major town and village were deported. And that number of 800,000 in the first 4 months, I say it because it's 200,000 a month, which is the same number as happened in Rwanda. All right, so when you're looking at other genocides, it's that rate of the killing that's also indicative of the genocidal nature of the killing. It's not numbers aren't the most important thing, but the speed and the simultaneity with which it's done is often crucial to the success, all right, of a genocidal plan. Okay, technology, as I said, telegraph was used to communicate the orders, right? Again, this is making use of the, and by the way, every branch of the government was involved, all right? It wasn't just the military. This is coming out of Constantinople, and it's going back and forth to the provinces using the telegraph. The new railway, I mentioned that Berlin to Baghdad railroad, they were used to ship Armenians into the desert. They would pack the cars, the railroad cars, filled with Armenians. Oftentimes, they made them buy the ticket first. So you'd get to the station, they'd force them to buy a ticket, and then the train would stop somewhere in the middle of the desert. If you didn't die from suffocation on the way over, they were taken out and shot then in the middle of the desert. Or then they were just left, in many cases, particularly in the east, to tribesmen to come. This is another question. I guess you'll see more about this in the film that you'll be looking at next week. But there's also a number of cases, and we don't know exact numbers, of how many Armenian women, particularly girls, were taken and then just became part of another family. And I mean becoming part, that they were taken and forced into marriages. They were taken at young ages, and they grew up, and afterwards they just forgot, they didn't forget who they were, but they just became part of this new society. But there could be as many as 50,000. We don't really know. We don't have exact numbers of how many people, but nowadays in Turkey, especially in the eastern portion, a lot of people will say, oh, my grandmother was Armenian, or my great-grandmother was Armenian. And you know, they've known this as like family history, but officially it never happened. And so it's, as I said, incredibly disruptive, incredibly painful, and it's something that people now are looking into their own family background. A special organization, Teşkilat-i Mahsusa, was established, whose primary objective was to expedite the killing of the Armenian population. Right? And as I said, Armenians were gathered in concentration camps. And there's a whole dynamic of concentration camp life that's being explored now by scholars such as Khachik Muradian that, again, will be eerily familiar to anybody who studies other genocides and holocausts. Okay. Legalization. As I mentioned, this is a critical point too. Between May and December 1915, there were a series of laws issued. And you know, I'll go through these quickly, but it authorized the deportation of Armenians, you know, saying that they have to be deported. It's a rule. They secured and registered the property of the Armenians. This was key. They made the Armenians first go and register at a local, at the local magistrate, or at the local sort of equivalent of City Hall, right, and list every single piece of their property. And they were told, you'll get it when you come back. Right? We're compiling these lists so that you can then say when you come back, you'll know exactly, you know, what you had, and we'll be able to check that. Right? Then they created, or pretty much simultaneously, an abandoned properties administration, right, that every 15 days is reporting to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or the Ministry of the Interior. Right? So once they're gone, they then say, well, nobody who comes back, right, we need now a way of handling the confiscation of this property, because these people, surprisingly, are not coming back to claim their houses or their property. Right? So they quickly, and every 15 days, they're reporting back how much they're gathering, how much wealth they're accumulating. Right? And then they had a formal process for the liquidation of Armenian properties. Right? How you can sell them, who can sell them, where the money goes, and how it could be distributed to which parties. Can the state? How much does the state get? How much does the local community get? So here we have one of these receipts for this liquidation of Armenian property. According to Talat Pasha's own accounts, and they know this because when he was killed by an Armenian, it's Soghomon Tehlirian, who's buried in Fresno, saw Talat Pasha after the war was over. The triumvirate fled. They were then found guilty in absentia of murdering the Armenian population by an Ottoman court under the British protectorate. And the three leaders fled. Talat Pasha was cited in Berlin by an Armenian who was living there. And he subsequently went, he got a gun, followed him around again, and in broad daylight in the middle of a square, shot him. And then waited to be arrested. His trial was a big deal in Germany, right? And he was found innocent of murder, right? And it was almost a self-defense trial. But it was a major debate within Germany whether this guy just shot somebody in broad daylight. You know, what are you going to do with him? But he was found. He was cleared of all charges given what Talat Pasha had done. But one of the things that Talat Pasha had on him was his diary, that kept an account of all of these properties that he said that they had been able to confiscate. And this was his own personal list of confiscated properties that he had recorded. So 20,545 buildings, 267,536 acres of land, almost 77,000 acres of vineyards, almost 704,000 acres of olive groves, and 4,573 acres of mulberry gardens were confiscated. That's just that he had made a personal note in his diary. All right, so there's, it's a lot. It was a lot of money. There was a lot of property and a lot of capital that managed to be confiscated from the Armenian population and then was subsequently carried over into the modern Republic of Turkey. Okay. The Armenian genocide was also internationalized, another feature of modernity. And it's not that people didn't know about it. People knew it was happening. Right? They got constant reports. You remember the United States was neutral in World War I at the beginning. And so our ambassador, Henry Morgenthau, was there. Right? We had consuls stationed throughout the empire. They kept writing back saying, what's going on is a mass extinction of the Armenian people. Henry Morgenthau tried to talk to Talat Pasha, right, and say, why are you doing this? You can't get away with this. And Talat Pasha said, look, if we leave any child left alive, you don't think they're going to come back and try and take revenge? Right? So, they were going to go through with this. We knew it was happening. Again, over 200 articles in the New York Times appeared between 1915 and 1922. Henry Morgenthau wrote about it. American missionaries talked about it. America was very concerned about it. What are they going to do is a different question. But it was clear that people realized this was going on. And in 1933, Franz Werfel wrote a book called 40 Days of Musadach that became an international bestseller. It was originally written in German. It was translated into several languages, including English, right? And was even supposed to be made into a film, right, by MGM. Was very excited about that until the State Department called up Mr. Mayer and said, you're not making that film. And he said, what are you talking about? And the Republic of Turkey at that time had called the State Department and said, unless you want us to join with the Soviets, there's no way that film is getting made. And so the film was squashed by the State Department and it never turned into a major motion film. But internationalization is an aspect of this, and as well as the relief efforts. Right? The American Committee for Relief in the Near East, which is now the Near Eastern Relief Fund, was founded, right, in order to help the refugees and the orphans from the genocide. And between 1916 and 1930, raised $116 million in relief money. That's $1.5 billion today. It's the largest relief effort ever launched to this day. All right? How many people learned about this in school? I was going to say, right? This is a great thing, actually, that America did that we're not taught. Right? It's a shame. And it's because of the current political situation that this is not taught in our schools. Right? Okay, I can understand when they say, look, World War I, it's busy, it's complicated, the Armenian genocide, we can't get to it. But this is a remarkable thing that the United States of America was able to do. It involved presidents. It involved senators. It involved celebrities for the first time. Babe Ruth, people know Babe Ruth, he presented one of his home run bats, right, in support for auction to support Armenian orphans to a Miss Nivart Zeron Koshkarian. All right? Child actors were involved. I mean, they're not famous, they're not so famous to us today, but it was a huge deal. I mean, my mother, who was born in 1930, remembers the phrase starving Armenians, right, and how common that was when she was growing up about what happened to the Armenians. But this all starts to go into a silence about the 1940s. In the 30s and the 40s, time passes, but it's also because of the efforts of the Turkish State Department and the United States State Department as a conscious effort to forget that this happened. I mean, some things happen. Obviously, World War II eclipses World War I in the United States imagination, but nonetheless, this sort of work that the United States did, which was an incredible amount of relief work, now goes unheralded here in the States. It also helped define the word genocide. As you may have noticed, all right, the word genocide did not exist in 1915, 1914. You may have noticed in those articles they don't use the word genocide, right? They can't. They didn't have a word for it. So they talk about it as mass killing, attempts of total annihilation, the extinction of a people. And you see this. You can see them trying to grapple with what's going on and come up with some sort of phrase, a word that might capture how bad this is. And you can feel them struggling because they won't just say, oh, there was a mass killing of Armenians. It goes, there's a mass killing which amounts to a near total annihilation of a people. And it goes on. They just try to pile up phrase after phrase until Raphael Lemkin comes up with the word genocide in 1944. he and his family are survivors of the Holocaust, but he had already been working on crimes against humanity before the Holocaust, and he notes that he grew up with the reports of the Armenian genocide, and this is partially one of the cases, one of the foundational cases for him that got him into studying crimes against humanity and coming up with the term genocide to describe what he calls these specific instances of mass murder in this way. So it's also instrumental in that sense, in that we use the word genocide as well. Now, the Armenian genocide in the modern Middle East. The modern Middle East, even though it's a complex place, nonetheless, in some ways, it was an even more complex place 100 years ago. Right? It was a much more ethnically diverse area. And the Armenian genocide destroyed a vital cultural and economic center of Anatolia in the Middle East. Right? It instigated diasporas, whether of the Armenian population, the Greek population, and the Syrian population. Right? One of the, I don't like using benefits, but a positive unintended consequence of the genocide are the successful Armenian communities throughout the United States, Europe, Australia, right, that have managed to make new lives for themselves. It's a very weird equation to think about, but nonetheless, our country would not look the same if this hadn't happened. Right? Europe wouldn't look the same if this hadn't happened. To me, that's a positive effect for us, but it's definitely a negative effect on the Middle East and Turkey. All right? And the confiscation of all this wealth became part of the economic basis for the Republic of Turkey through the appropriation of this capital. And that's one of the areas in which people are working on now, because one of the claims denialists like to make, will say, well, that happened under the Ottoman Empire, it has nothing to do with the Republic of Turkey. And that's, I'm sorry, BS, right? Because the modern Republic of Turkey is founded upon the back of the Armenian genocide, whether ideologically or even financially. Right? It's true because Mustafa Kemal Ataturk did not participate in the Armenian genocide itself. Right? He even acknowledged it early, but soon realized what the ramifications would be if the Republic of Turkey recognized the Armenian genocide and quickly tried to shovel it under a rug, and promoted a denialist position later on. And it began a process of ethnic cleansing of the Middle East that continues to this day. As I said, if you looked at the Middle East 100 years ago, it's not what it looks like today. Many more different communities there, many more languages spoken. There's been a reduction in the ethnic diversity and the cultural diversity of the Middle East to its own detriment, right? And we see it today, right, in the destruction of communities and culture that continue now with ISIS, but it's not just ISIS. You have this elsewhere, but the destruction of communities and cultural artifacts. You see it with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where, as I said, the Armenian population of this enclave within Azerbaijan has voted for independence. Azerbaijan doesn't want to give it independence, and in order to erase the presence of Armenians, has gone about destroying, God bless you, Armenian cultural monuments throughout the region. So, for example, in the region of Nakhichevan, which is under Azeri control, right, where they destroy these tombstones and khachkars. Plus, we see it in the refugee crisis today. If you looked at Aleppo, even 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it had a flourishing Armenian community that was doing very well. That was a major part of the society. There's nearly no one left there today. Right? Syria, which had maybe 150,000 Armenians, has nowhere near, has maybe 500 today. Most of them have had to get up and leave. They're not the only ones, obviously, who have suffered from this disintegration of regional politics, but nonetheless, we see this continuation of ethnic cleansing, whether as directed under the Ottoman Empire or not, occurring in the Middle East, and it's reducing its ethnic diversity, its cultural diversity, and also, I would say, then it's what was its inherent strength, the ability to harness all of these different peoples and be able to have them interact, not always peacefully, but at least there was always that cultural dynamic. Now, slightly differently, if we're looking at history and memory and history, depending on how you want to look at it, what good is it? Why do we bother? Are we supposed to come around every year on April 24th and cry for the 1.5 million who are dead? This is a challenge. What good does that do? And I've had people say to me, it happened 100 years ago, why do you care? You know, a lot of things happened 100 years ago we don't remember. Well, one thing did happen that changed things was that in 2015, the Armenian Apostolic Church officially canonized the victims. Right? That means they were not just victims now, they were saints. Okay? And what this meant was that we were no longer able to mourn them. And that was explicitly said. We can no longer cry for those who died during the genocide, because now they're saints. And that means that you're supposed to celebrate the fact that you now have somebody who can help you. And regardless of the theology of all this, what I do like is the emphasis is it puts on the continuity between the past and the present, and the fact that the past informs and challenges the present. These are not people that we cry for who died 100 years ago. They're people that we turn to inform us about what we are doing today and challenge us, right, by being better than we, are. They're the ones who are supposed to help guide us, right? The process of remembering is not just to wallow in that memory. It's not of nostalgia, but to help us move forward. Right? And that becomes very important, and I think the Armenian Church did an amazing thing by canonizing them. And especially now, we are in a period of global transition. It is not, I don't see any way over the next couple of decades that there will be a good resolution to this. I hate to say that. Most of us will probably continue to live very privileged lives and not experience any pain or trauma, but I can't say it will be that way for the rest of the world. Right? There's the problem of globalization that has not been adequately resolved, income inequality based on that globalization, massive movements of people from economically depressed areas to more economically privileged areas. There's a lot of transition, there's a lot of disruption. We need to be careful how we handle this transition. There are no easy answers, there are no simple answers. Looking to the past, remembering, right? Even if it's just remembering what your grandparents told you. But studying history, while it's not a blueprint for the future, at least always gives us reason to be cautious. Always gives us reason to pause and to think, what is going to happen with what I do? Right? It's easy to sit and blame people. I'm not a big fan of blaming people. Oh, these people were like this, and they were terrible, and these people were terrible. I'm going to tell you 100 years from now, we're terrible. They're going to say the same things about us. I don't like this, but it's like people always blame their parents for their problems. Right? It doesn't matter at the end of the day. At the end of the day, it matters what you do. And it's only by constantly reminding yourself of the past that I think we can avoid the specters of the past. And I just want to show you, this picture may be familiar to people, of a Yazidi refugee in 2014. And there's an Armenian refugee from about 100 years before. In many ways, we've traveled a long way. To the moon, right? Outer space, the bottoms of the ocean, Amazon, drones, great. And yet, in many profound ways, we haven't moved at all in the past 100 years. And that's why it's still with us. And it's only by remembering and learning from that that hopefully, right, we can lose this ghost, right, and move into the future. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions. Question? Yes.
Thank you for coming and speaking. I found it really fascinating what you were just talking about, how they canonize the victims. But I was wondering, you spoke at the beginning about how in California we're supposed to be taught this going on.
Yeah.
I was wondering if globally, have you seen a trend towards teaching this in terms of in Europe and in the East and in other countries?
Very good question. I mean, obviously in the Republic of Armenia it's taught. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know how it's taught in Europe. And I would think it would differ. Like in France, I would presume that given the size of the Armenian population there, which is about 500,000, that it may have more representation in the education system. As I said, I lived in Israel for 8 years, and there it's part of the curriculum, and it was introduced into the curriculum officially. Again, official incorporation of a theme into the curriculum doesn't seem to always necessarily result in what happens on the ground, and it's difficult given the current climate. And I mean the current climate meaning that because the United States doesn't officially acknowledge it, and the textbooks that are used aren't made in California, the textbooks don't reflect the curriculum, and that puts the teachers in a bad position. And there's also just the problem, and I'm sure many of you experience that as you get closer and closer to the 20th century in your history class, you start having to speed things up a little bit, and then people automatically start jumping to World War II and start seeing the contours of the world being shaped then. And I think one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is that both the shape of the United States and the shape of the world is more dependent upon what happens in World War I than World War II. And World War II is, in some ways, is a great teaching point because you got something that's clearly evil, something that's clearly good in that way, but it masks I would say the sort of the complex situation of not having clear objectives, not having a clear vision of what to do that marked World War I. And that seems to be more reflective of what the facts are on the ground. And so when we divorce that from our American history, in particular, I think we get a very skewed sense of how geopolitics and even you can say the compositions of various countries have shaped over the past century. Not to mention, you tend to hide one of what I think is a high point in American political involvement with the relief effort that it launched. So I see this from a particularly American point of view as critical to understanding American history, not just history of the Armenians. And I can understand, they're not teaching in either in American history or world history. I can understand that you're not, making the Armenians the center of of your course. But to me, this is actually a very central moment in American history, and that's what bothers me, that aspect of it isn't even taught here. Is there a question over here? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're very, very interrelated. And I know a Syrian, a friend of mine, but his last name is. When I saw it, I thought he was Armenian, but except for his first name, which was distinctly Syrian. But he said that his grandmother knew that she was Syrian because she would sing "Asuri em yes," which is an Armenian song, but because they normally say "Hi em yes, I'm Armenian," but they just changed the word to "I am Syrian," the lyric. Yeah. Yeah. They very close interaction between the two communities. You had a question?
First of all, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. First of all,
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. And I am not. Oh, sorry. He said the money that was raised for the relief efforts, where did it go? And I don't actually know the exact answer to that, but it's something I should look more into. But a lot of it did go to the settlement of the refugees in the United States. Right? When they came, there were a number of orphans here, and so a number of it went for that. But they also had missions to, for example, Port Said, where there were large concentrations of Armenians. I mean, one of the problems of doing these presentations, and one of our, we say 1915, 1923, this thing goes on, right? The repercussions of it keep on going on, and if So, for example, my wife's grandmother spent 2 years in Egypt, and she didn't, she went through Aleppo, managed to get out of Aleppo, and was in Port Said in Egypt, where there was another camp for Armenians, and then was there for 2 years. Now, she didn't know she was going to be there for 2 years. You don't know how long you're going to be there, but for the maintenance of those camps, they needed relief, they needed money. And so they led humanitarian missions across the Near East to try and help these people, sometimes there and sometimes to settle them when they came in here. So that's where, I don't know where all of the $116 million went, but that's what Near East relief did in general. For Turkey, it's very difficult. That's a complex question because technically, after World War I, the European powers were thinking of dismembering the Ottoman Empire, and so you get mandate for Britain, France is getting Syria, and people are carving this all up. At the same time, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk is launching the nationalist, what they call the liberation movement for Turkey. He's centered in Ankara because they don't have anything else. Basically, Europe is... Historically, when you're looking at Anatolia, everybody wants the coastlines. Nobody gives a darn about the center because it's high plateau. It's not very profitable in that sense. And so the nationalist forces were reduced to like the central plateau region, right? And so he launched a series of military conflicts against both the Western powers and eventually even attacking the Armenians, and they were able to stop them at Sadarabad, and that's what preserved the Republic of Armenia there. But most of Europe was like, look, we just went through 4 years of hell fighting, we're not going to now fight. But even then, you have places like Musadag that don't wind up going to Turkey until much later, until like the 30s, because it's part of Syria for a while, and then they negotiate that, and France allows them to have it, and it's a very complex, it's a much more confused picture, and it's not as though everybody sat down at Versailles in 1918 and drew nice lines. That didn't happen. They drew the lines, it just didn't reflect anything afterwards. I'm sorry, the gentleman, yeah. Yes, you. Yeah. Sure. Well, again, not something that's simple to talk about. I can go back to the slide. It's at the beginning, though. It may not be working. But the problem is you have two stages where Armenia was the Republic of Armenia, there's a period after 1918 where the Republic of Armenia is independent. That's known as the First Republic of Armenia. Basically is somewhat similar to this state here. It then becomes part of the Transcaucasus Republic. And very quickly then they fall to, there's a big problem within Armenia as to whether they're going to be independent or they're going to become Soviet. They're going to be independent nationalists under which was the nationalist position is that they should be independent, but there was a large socialist contingent within the country and a Soviet contingent that said that their survival would depend upon incorporation with the Soviet Union. So the First Republic lasts just not very long, it's like a little over a year, and then it's incorporated eventually within the Soviet Union, and that's the Second Republic, and then, as is Azerbaijan. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Armenia declares independence, so does Azerbaijan, but they're left with the problem of this ethnically Armenian enclave, which is Nagorno-Karabakh. Now the other problem here is Nakhichevan, which also was Armenian, but wound up going to Azerbaijan. But the Nagorno-Karabakh area was a much bigger problem where most of the population of it was Armenian, and they voted in a referendum for independence. But there had already been conflicts prior to independence. Starting in 1988, they launched a war. Their war was fought between the the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and Azeri forces. The Armenians eventually won. However, it's still an unresolved conflict, so there's no peace treaty. It's just there's been a ceasefire, and a ceasefire, again, there's still every day shooting across the border. And Azerbaijan says that there are two competing international claims here. Azerbaijan says that Nagorno-Karabakh disrupts Azeri territorial integrity, and so that it should be Azeri in order to maintain Azeri territorial or Azerbaijani territorial integrity, while the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh as it's known in Armenian, claim the right for self-determination because they are a distinct ethno-religious community, that they have a right towards of self-determination, and therefore, I mean, they've set up their own government, they have their own currency, they have their own military. It's just that nobody recognizes it. And so there's still a process of negotiation going on, but you know, I can't see any sort of resolution in sight at the moment. I mean, hopefully there will be one, but I don't know. Yeah. This is another interesting question. I mean, the Kurds were often the ones committing the killing, right? The Kurds at that time, and I remember I went to I went to Turkey with an Armenian group, and we went out to eastern Turkey to a town that's all Kurdish now, that used to be Armenian. And the Kurds came out and they greeted us, very friendly, very warm, and then they said, where'd you bury the gold? And they said, excuse us? They said, look, the Turks told our grandparents that if you killed all the Armenians in the village, you could have their gold. We've dug up the entire place, and there were still pits. Right? We dug up the entire, under every house, we dug up the entire graveyard. All we found were gold fillings. Where is it? And they're convinced, like, I have to say Armenians sometimes play a trick on them. They're convinced that when Armenians come back to visit, that they're coming back to get their gold. So I know some Armenians who have gone and like taken the map and they've opened it up and they start walking around and like the whole village follows them. You know, it's sort of cruel, but you know, it's a very weird sort of dynamic because on the one hand, at that time too, this is when I went, was in 96, 97. There was no, you know, the airline I took there talked about a town on Lake Van called Akhlat. 5,000-year-old history. Don't mention the Armenians once in the entire article. Right? Even though they were there from, you know, 1000 BCE to 1915. Right? You just didn't see any recognition of anything. So to have somebody come up to you and admit that this actually happened. In Van, in the museum at Van, right, which is also one of the major centers, there was a wing dedicated to the Armenian genocide. And that meant they had all these skulls there that were supposed to represent Turks who the Armenians had killed. So their understanding of the Armenian genocide was the genocide that Armenians committed against the local Turks, which is sort of like surprising considering there are no Armenians there now. They don't explain what happened to them afterwards. But so to have someone actually come up to you and say, this happened, like the people who, you know, it was their grandparents who had fled the village, were like, on the one hand, they were like, this is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. And on the other hand, they were very grateful that there was nothing like, oh, Armenians never lived here. You know, so it's a very weird sort of dynamic. Now, it's gotten better, and relations between Armenians and Kurds have gotten better recently, which has been great to see. So Diyarbakir, the town of Diyarbakir, restored an Armenian church, and that was thanks to the Kurdish mayor. They also have a monument to the Armenian genocide, a small one, but it's there, a plaque that says but this now has become part of Kurdish politics against the state, right? So this is, which is fine, but we have to understand it because the Kurds themselves now are targeted by the Turkish state in much the same way as the Armenians were, right? Now that they're the ones who are the majority there that the Turks can't trust, they're trying to break down Kurdish identity and break down any sort of Kurdish movement towards independence. And so the Kurds have, you know, almost like, you know, this strange twist of fate, become very interested in what happened during the Armenian genocide. even though many times that they were the perpetrators. They're willing to accept that because they see what's happening now, and they use it. For them, what's more important is that the Turkish state is sort of weakened in that sense. Okay, the questions. Oh, you had a question here?
Yeah, I was wondering, what happened after the triumph fell to all the land they expropriated?
Which, I'm sorry, like,
Yeah, so all the Armenian
yes.
property.
Again, yes, right. It was transferred to the Republic of Turkey eventually. There were another series of laws that were issued, and actually the Republic of Turkey also put another one of those. Anybody who has not returned to claim land that had been appropriated by the Ottoman Empire by, I forget what the year was, 1920, it was like, 1 week after they issued it, and it was clear none of these people were going to come back, that would all then transfer to the Republic of Turkey. So they were able to appropriate it and then redistribute it, right, to members of either the party, the Republican Party, or to local populations. So it turned out to be a windfall for the Republic of Turkey. Yes?
The Turks are very resolute about their interpretation of the
Right.
Armenian genocide. And all this time that they've been trying to get into the EU has said to them, look at how you treat the Kurds. And so they try to be very nice in order to remain powers. The Germans finally recognize the Armenian genocide.
Yeah.
The Turks throw out the German ambassador.
Right.
With Erdogan in power, I don't see any progress being made towards some reinterpretation of what happened. Are there groups in Turkey, young people who have traveled abroad, gone to school in Europe, who say, look, they're telling us a different story, a little transparency would be nice?
Yes. And again, it's another excellent question. It's also extremely complicated. When we're looking at relations between the EU and Turkey, the EU is like amazingly silent on both the Kurdish issue and the Armenian genocide when it comes to EU acceptance. Now, having said that, many people in the Armenian population of Turkey, there's still a small, about 50,000 Armenians now live in Turkey. Some that are left over in Constantinople, the majority of them are still there, of that 50,000, and then very, very small communities elsewhere. And there's an Armenian patriarch of Constantinople. Were very much in favor of trying to get Turkey in the EU, hoping that the protections that the EU affords its own minority populations would therefore be transferred to Turkey, and therefore Armenian sites inside of Turkey would have to be preserved as historical monuments. The treatment of Kurds, Kurds were also for because of the treatment of Kurds. But this is, again, a complex dynamic. Are you rewarding, is the EU rewarding Turkey for its denialist positions by accepting it into the EU and think that they're going to change after they've been accepted? Or should they use this as a stick to have them accept it, which, that's the way Turkey sees it, right? They said they're doing the same exact thing today as they did in the late 19th century. They're are being accepted into Europe with having to admit to this sort of thing that never happened, right? They're trying to browbeat us. And they do use that language with reference to this. And the question, I think, has always been whether, for the Europeans, the cash cow that Turkey would be, that it's a 60 million person market that would open up much more freely if they were part of the EU, as well as the geopolitical positioning of Turkey, which has always made it a desirable ally for people, whether it's in Europe or the United States, being near Russia. Whether that would outweigh any of these moral considerations. So, the pushback from Europe has not been as great as you would expect, considering, their stance on a lot of other issues. You'd expect them to be a little bit more forceful, both on the Armenian genocide issue and on the Kurdish issue, but they've been sort of Janus-faced, I think, on that particular issue as well. As for Turks inside the country, first of all, and this was, with Erdogan, I wanted to get back to Erdogan. Many people, Armenians included, were hopeful when Erdogan was elected because he's part of the Islamist party and not part of the Nationalist Party. The Islamist Party, one could argue, had less invested in the nationalist discourse that had Turkey as a Turkish nation, and that you could easily say that this happened under a different, it would be easier for them to say that it happened under a different regime. However, as soon as he was in power, right, all of that quickly disappeared. And I think there's several reasons. He, like his predecessors, has realized that you have an entire country that has been brought up on this lie. Right? They are educated from year one all the way through college, and it's relentless. Right? It's not just that they don't talk about it. I mean, they actively talk about the Armenian conspiracy against Turks. Right? This is taught in their history, in their high schools, in their grade schools. Right? And even today, some of the more disturbing things too, even the Kurds are now, so one of the things that you saw when there were Kurdish attacks earlier, was it earlier this year or last year, 2015, what they would call them in public, right, on the news media, the people who were going, let's say they were Turks who were killed, police officers or whatever, the families would call the Kurds who did this bastard Armenians. They weren't even Armenian. It doesn't matter. But that idea of whoever is against the state, it must be Armenian at some level. So, what do you do? And this is now what Turkish scholars have told me. And one of the reasons why they're interested in the Armenian, because they do feel like I was brought up on this lie. But what happens if an entire country realizes that they were lied to by their government on this issue for like 70 years? What else then do you start to question? Where else is the government lied? Do you think it's just going to be on this one issue? And so I think Erdogan realized, and these intellectuals who, the ones that I know are they're pro-Turkish in the sense of they're like, look, I'm Turkish, I'm a Turk, I love Turkey, right? And it's because of that, their patriotism says we can't live anymore, in this denial, because it only hurts us at the end. We're cut off from our own history, and a lot of them started getting interested in it because they felt like this history was not taught. Their own history was not taught, and they didn't know what was there. And so then they started asking questions and looking into archives and then talking to other people, and they're like, oh my God, where did this come from? And then you can see that light turn on in their head, and then they realize that what they're looking at is an entire state that controls the way they think. And if the entire population realizes that, the state's in trouble. And so their theory is that this, more than anything else, look, reparations, the stigma of having committed genocide, Germany's been, they wouldn't be alone with the stigma. And they have sort of a stigma anyway, whether fairly or unfairly. The reparations, I don't think would be that big of a deal. And in any case, probably the United States would help pay for some of it overall. But the reparations, it's a successful country financially. They'd find ways of doing it, right? There's not going to be any land returned to anybody. That's not going to happen. The Armenians can ask for it, but it'd be very hard to enforce that sort of. The main obstacle, I think, would be the financial reparations. How much? But you can negotiate. Money you can handle. But the one thing they can handle is the realization that the backbone, that the whole nationalist ideology and basically the philosophy of the state itself is founded upon a lie. And that's non-negotiable for them. And that's why these scholars are very much pessimistic about Turkey ever admitting it. Because it's not for the reasons that we normally think somebody would be reluctant to. Because after time, it happened 100 years ago, nobody alive actually committed it. You could say, why don't they just admit it? And a lot of people, why don't they just admit it? And, and then they're saying, look, if they admit it, the whole facade crumbles. And then they have the whole issue with the Kurds, right, which exacerbates it. So yes, there are some people who do that, but you have to realize how much of the state is invested. That's why I said even an airplane magazine didn't, it's immense, the amount of money, and they fund positions in the United States. And, they take out articles in the New York Times, right? They put in advertisements, right? If you're a Turkish scholar and you signed a petition or have anything to do with genocide recognition, good luck getting a visa to do any work there, right? I mean, if you're not a Turk and you want to use the state archives, good luck, right? The scholars have found ways into these things, but this is an obsession of the state. I mean, and unless there's a real revolution in that sense, they may be right. There may not be a way forward under what we would consider normal sort of progression of, okay, we admit that it happened and, we can settle now on some sort of reparation. But if this is the real heart of it, that's a much more complicated issue for them. I hope they'll do it. I mean, that's, it'll be, if they can't, I don't know how much longer the state will be successful in any case. But any other questions? Oh, there was one more question. Oh, yeah.
We know there were about 6,000 people killed.
Yeah. No. I mean, no, that part is really interesting. The documentation, the properties. Yeah, most of those, the lists are very interesting. You can't find them, right? Now, how do we know they exist then, right? One of the interesting things is that some communities, some municipalities, well, actually all of the municipalities kept copies. One copy went to Constantinople, right, where it's put in the state archives. Whether they're there or not, I have no idea. They may have a list of every single, or they could have destroyed them. They could have destroyed them at any point in the past. We have no idea. But local municipalities, right, put it on a shelf, put it in a box, left it there. And nobody thought about it afterwards. And some scholars in Turkey have found that they can go in, it's easier to go into the municipality of the middle of nowhere and ask to, especially if you're from there and say, do you mind if I use the library? And they go, yeah, sure, whatever, I'm going to go get coffee. And then you go through. And so some scholars have found it that way. I don't want to say too much because, it's not, but they've done remarkable work by using a sort of back door. But it's not sure that every single municipality kept these because, again, it was useless to them after a certain point. So they may have thrown them out. They may have just, deteriorated from conditions. There may have been an actual, desire to expunge them. But yeah, we have no idea what the actual Turkish National State Archives contain because they don't want to, they won't let you into those things. So we don't know if they've kept them. We don't know if they've destroyed them. And so we have to be a little bit more creative in how we find these sort of documents. But as for a list, we have census. The census isn't like a person-by-person one from the 1890s and stuff like that, 1880s. It just says, this village, 10,000 Armenians, 13,000 Turks, and it's not always clear. Then they'll say, sometimes it's Armenian Apostolic, separated from Armenian Catholics and Protestants. It's a little bit, it's not always that easy, but these things have been published. And that's why we get to a figure of between 2 and 3 million Armenians may have been alive at the beginning of the genocide, and then it's 50,000, afterwards, approximately. The missing, there's a possible another 100,000 who may have converted and melded into Turkish society. Then there are all the women and girls who were taken and married off, and all of those numbers, we can make, people say, we have no idea. We can only take estimates based on what we think the total population is, how many, we know there are about 1.5 that are dead by 1923, about 500,000 who are displaced, but we're not then exactly sure, what happens to everyone else. So it's complicated. Okay, thank you. Thank you.